Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this IAAP Nordic webinar in English. And I will start with giving the floor to my dear friend Radek, who will give a little bit of an introduction in Czech, which I always admire you for speaking, but I cannot speak myself. So would you please like to address our Czech audience, Radek?
Dobrý den všem. Bohužel nemám úplně pozitivní zprávu. Nepodařilo se nám zprovoznit simultánní tlumočení do češtiny. Takže ho nejsme schopni dneska poskytnout, ale webinář nahrajeme a připravíme k němu české titulky, co nejdřív to půjde, takže pro ty z vás, pro které je angličtina překážka, tak se moc omlouváme, ale dneska nejsme schopni to tlumočení z technických důvodů zajistit, ale jakmile to bude možné, nabídneme titulky. Děkujeme moc za pochopení, přejeme pěkný den a užijte si webinář, aspoň ti z vás, kdo můžete sledovat angličtinu. Thank you, Susanna. What is your again?
Thank you, Radek. So I will just tell people what I think you said, which is that we are sometimes collaborating with our volunteers in the Czech Republic. So Radek and Teresia's University of Brno and their fantastic tech team to have sometimes captions in Czech language and sometimes even simultaneous interpretation into Czech. And today, for some reason, the technology is not with us. So despite having the best tech team in the world, we cannot provide that, but we will make a recording as always, and then make sure that that recording is simultaneously, is that then simultaneously interpreted or, well, anyway, interpreted into Czech, both in spoken language and also with captions. So I'm very sorry about this, but this will be provided afterwards. So in this series, the IAAP Nordic series, we do provide automatic captions and the closed captions in Zoom, and please use the Q&A function if you would like to ask questions. My name is Susanna Loren. I am the leader of the IAAP Nordic chapter. We cover Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and since a couple of months, we also cover Iceland, which we are very happy about. And at today's meeting, we have many attendees also from other parts of the world than only the Nordic region. So we're extremely happy to see that. And I just realized when I look at the registration that we don't actually ask for country when we do registrations in the Nordics, because we're so used to just doing them internally in the Nordic countries. But welcome everyone, and especially the ones of you who are not members of our chapter, but joining us anyway. So that's even more rewarding. And we do these webinars usually in English because many of the Nordic countries, we speak similar languages, but in Finland, they have a completely different language, extremely beautiful, but difficult for the rest of us to understand. So to make sure that we are all on the same page, we do sometimes provide these, or very often provide these free webinars in English. So as you probably know, IAAP is a member organization. We are working with education and professional certification for accessibility experts. And if you become a member of the regional chapter, we have chapters in the Nordic region and then in the German-speaking parts and the UK and so on, many different places over the globe, then you are immediately also a member of the global organization. So you get the best of two worlds. You get the fantastic opportunity to share knowledge with the best ranking experts from more than 100 countries. And you can also make sure that you get into the weeds of what is happening in your own region, and often in your local language, of course. So today we are going to talk a little bit about documents and accessible documents. And I'm very happy to welcome Annika Valtari from EFICode in Finland and Peter Kemeni, who is working with Funka in Sweden, but who is based in Hungary. So that's also interesting from a language point of view, because Hungarian and Finnish is actually somewhat connected. And we will talk about accessible documents today, a little bit like an interview session or discussion between our two experts who come to this accessible document topic from slightly different perspectives. And then, of course, leave room in the end for Q&A from the audience. So please do ask questions. You can ask whenever you like in the Q&A function, and we will make sure to respond to them in the end. And my colleague Alberto Highlander is making sure everything works today and is also responding to any technical issues, but he has a very sore throat today, so he won't say hi, but I know he's there somewhere. I would like maybe to start with Annika to just introduce yourself shortly.
Thank you, Susanna. Happy to be here today. I'm Annika Valtari from Efficode. I work as a UX and accessibility lead at the moment, and I have done a lot of accessibility consultation for a lot of different types of organizations, especially when it comes to accessible documents. So happy to be talking about that subject to you today.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. And Peter, do you want to say a little bit about your relationship to accessible documents?
Yeah. So hi, as I said, I'm Peter Kamin. I'm working with Funka's research and innovation department. Sorry. We do projects, and we have a forward-looking view, but also to make sure that what we produce is accessible. I medaled a couple of years ago already in accessible documents, and I really like the challenges it gives to me. I'm more showing an approach from the technical side today, and I think it's a fantastic area, a very interesting thing, and very important, as we'll try to explain now.
I am so happy that somebody thinks that PDFs can be fantastic. I'm in the part of the humanity that is not that excited with PDFs. And I'm not going to do the presentation. So I would first like to ask Annika, what is an accessible document? I mean, what are we talking about here? Can you just give us a short explanation? What is it, and why is it a topic? Why is such a hot topic still in the accessibility community?
Yes, of course, when we are talking about accessibility, we need to remember that there are a lot of different types of users who have different types of user needs. So basically, we need to make sure that our documents are accessible to ensure that different types of users are able to read them and understand them. And these different types of user needs that I mentioned, I'm going to give you some concrete examples to make it easier for you to understand what I'm talking about. So here in this example, I have a very simple PDF document, just a one-page document. It has a couple of headings, some regular text, one list, and one image with a pie chart. So now, how to actually make this PDF accessible to different types of users? First of all, if we think about people with low vision or presbyopia, so with age, we don't see, for example, four small fonts that easily. What do we need to consider? First of all, think about the font. Is it readable? When it comes to digital documents, it's good to use a sans serif type of font that is easier to read on a screen. And also, the font size should be large enough for everyone to be able to read the text. And also make sure that the contrast between text and its background is sufficient so that people with low vision will be able to read the text, for example, the blue text on white background. And also, if you are using diagrams or infographics, make sure that the graphical elements have sufficient contrast. For example, in this pie chart, the different sections need to stand out of the white background and also of the neighboring colors. And here we have used white space between the sections to actually make the contrast ratio large enough. So many different aspects that we need to consider. What else? If we think about a blind person, of course, we need to ensure that all the content is understandable without vision. And many blind users are using a screen reader so that they can actually listen to the content of the PDF. And when it comes to assistive technologies, such as the screen reader, we need to make sure that the PDF has tags in the background, because the tags is the only thing that the screen reader will read of the document. For example, in this example, we can see that there is a 1, heading level number 1. Then there is a text paragraph, heading level 2. Then there is a list, heading level 2 again, and a figure. So that is something that the screen reader can actually read out loud to the blind person. And also, we need to set the language correctly to make sure that the screen reader will read the content and, for example, all the numbers in the correct language. For example, my computer is in Finnish and my screen reader is in Finnish. But since this is an English document, it needs to read it in English to me so that I'm going to be able to understand the content. And since we have that one image in the example, we need a text alternative for the image for me to be able to understand it. It can be alt text, for example, telling me that it's a pie chart, level of accessibility in PDF files, and then listing the percentages presented in the image. Or another solution could be, for example, presenting the same information in a table or in regular text so that I would get the same information even without vision. If we think about motor disabilities, for example, in this example, we need to make sure that the keyboard, that the link can be activated just by using the keyboard, since many users are not using the mouse at all. If it was a PDF form, we would need to make sure that all the form elements can be used just with the keyboard and that the reading order is logical. How about if I was colorblind? In this example, we can see the same PDF page without color. And of course, all the content should be understandable without color. For example, the link should be distinguishable. Now it's underlined, so I can notice that there's a link. If we take a look at the diagram, now the legends and the percentages are presented in text. So I don't even have to understand the colors. I can just read very low 5%, low 18%, and so on, to be able to understand it without vision. Another solution would be, for example, using different patterns so that the color I don't have to actually see the colors to understand the diagram. And one more thing to consider is cognitive disabilities. And all the content and the terminology should be understandable. And of course, that's very important to all the readers of the document. And to make the text more readable, let's use simple sentences, short chapters, use subheadings and lists when it's possible to make the text easier to read. And it's also good to use both text and visuals, since some users it's easier for some users to understand the images and to others to understand the text. So use both methods. And it's also good to remember that some users with cognitive disabilities, they are actually also using the screen reader if they have, for example, difficulty reading. So it might be easier for them to listen to the screen reader read out loud the text to them. And as a summary of these user needs, so basically make sure that the document is readable to different types of users and that its contents are understandable, both when it comes to the layout of the document and when it comes to the technical solutions behind the document.
So thank you. It was a very good starting point going from the user perspective. And I realize I forgot to talk about what we are trying to cover in this webinar. It was so much focus on the Czech interpretation not working. So sorry for that. But we are going to, because we have had demand from our members and also in the advisory council to do something around accessible documents. And we know that some people need the basics, some people need the very advanced things. So we are trying to cover a little bit of many things today. And I know we have already got questions about the legal requirements, and we will touch upon that, and also a little bit about tools and different kinds of situations or where you use different documents and yeah, so how to do things. So we're trying to kind of cover a little bit of everything in this webinar. Sorry, I missed that part. So I know, Peter, you would like to also come from another perspective here. Now we've heard about the user needs, so you have another angle to do the same, to answer the same question. Why are we talking about this, and what is it about?
So what Annika listed, I think those were very good examples, and they show that accessibility has different layers or we have to address. So we talk at the same time about technical accessibility. That means we have to make documents accessible for assistive technology. So the tagging should be in order, reading order should be in order. Then we talk about accessible design, which is what type of fonts we use, what's the layout, not to have the text or the document too crowded so that it's difficult to understand. And then also we talk about the accessibility of the content, using images to help understanding the information, and so all these levels should come together and should be all accessible. It's not only about playing around with the text in a PDF, for example. What I would like to mention about accessible documents is for me the starting point that we talk about different documents. It can be a Word document, a PDF, a PowerPoint, or other types as well. And they all have their strengths and different focus. So I think that one of the most important things is to early on decide which is the best format that would carry the information we want to. Word is a dynamic, editable thing. PDF has the advantage that it appears the same way on any screen. And today there's a lot of things that we can adjust to make that more accessible. And then, for example, PowerPoint, I really like that example. It is a slide-based, chunky thing that actually is made for being shown with a presentation with spoken text. So if we take it out of that context, we have to be very careful. We have to know that it has limited possibilities to convey information. So we should decide how we use the document and which one to use, in which format.
Yeah, it's true. So, and according to our research since many years, PowerPoint is a really difficult format for many users with assistive technology. So no matter how well you do it, it's still very difficult for some. So if you can choose something else to send out, that is usually a good idea. But I want to ask you, both of you, really, what you have told me now is nothing new. This applies to everything, HTML, web accessibility, everything digital. So why are we talking about documents specifically? Because you haven't told me anything new now that couldn't be said about a website.
Yes, the requirements are very similar to all types of content when it comes to accessibility, whether it's a website or a document. So basically, you can use the knowledge that you have of web content when it comes to accessible documents as well.
But do I still need to train specifically, or can I just, if I know web accessibility, why couldn't I just do documents? Why do we need to do something extra?
Well, it's a different thing. So when you have, and that's also a decision to make. If you want to do a document or a website or a web page. Web page can be very much preferable. They are much more dynamic, but the world we live in is not only working with web pages or websites. So there's a lot of documents out there. It can be also easily distributed offline or in emails, and can be carried and read when you don't have a connection. So anyhow, they are there, even though today connection is not a problem. So and the solutions are different than for websites. For Word and PDF and other design documents, there's limitations. For PDF, there's a lot of work to make it accessible. So it's a whole different thing, in my opinion. The rules are the same, just how you get there are different.
Yeah, and it's good to remember that when you are creating a document, you are actually being the designer and the implementer yourself. So you need to know what you're doing.
That's very true, because usually in the web, somebody else made a design and you have a template and so on. But in the document, the risk of handling mistakes, so to speak, is much higher. And I would also like to add, so the reason why I asked the question is I think that many people who are working within the web, they are trained in web accessibility, or at least they know a little bit of what they're doing. But many people who create documents and publish documents, they may not be aware of documents. So I think in every organization, it's not enough that just the web professionals know about web accessibility. You need to kind of spread the knowledge also to people who are more document oriented. So that was where I was going with that question. So now let's go to the really nice things. Legislation, Peter, you're a lawyer, so let us know, what are the rules and laws that we need to follow? Can we have the short version, please?
Yeah, yes, I'll try to do that. Since 2016, we already have a legislation that requires documents to be accessible. So the Web Accessibility Directive explicitly talks about downloadable documents and forms. And it had a limited scope. It's for public sector bodies, but it's a huge step ahead. And it also gave us a standard, which is a later point. And so what is important for public sector bodies, that documents are also being monitored at a different level in different member states, but most of the member states monitor documents as well. And then came the European Accessibility Act, which has certain products and services in its scope. And for all of them, it's required to have the instructions provided in an accessible way. So if it's not printed on the products box and it's not on a website, but it's a document, that has to be accessible. And it includes also the description of the accessibility features of the product and the service. And it's also specifically talks about accessibility of ebooks. Now, what the European legislation also gave us is the European standard with the specific clause about non-web documents, which are the documents we talk about. And these are WCAG based, but that's why this, among many things, why this standard is acclaimed internationally, that it applies them for the WCAG requirements, applies them for documents and also to apps. And these are the legally obligatory standards, legally obligatory rules, laws and requirements. But there are also other requirements which help us to make documents accessible. And there's the PDF UA standard, which goes beyond the EN standard, much more technical, much more detailed, and helps us to reach an even higher level of accessibility. And then there are recommendations which are not legal requirements either, about readability, the font size, the font type, as Annika mentioned, not use italics, don't use justified alignment, and so on, and to use a proper structure and avoid jargons and things like that. So these all together help us make a document accessible and help us also comply with the legal requirements.
Okay, yes, thank you. And you said that the Web Accessibility Directive has a limited scope, which is of course true, but when you look at the number of documents within the public sector in Europe, that is a big scope. So I'm still amazed of how many and mostly inaccessible documents are out there. So I think we have a lot to do, and there's a requirement of more boots on the ground. More people need to know how to make documents accessible or stop using documents, and I don't think that will happen. So please, everyone who knows somebody who is working with documents, make sure that they get the basic training and maybe also a certification, because this is really needed. We see that public sector is moving ahead, not super fast, but still they are moving in the right direction when it comes to the web. Documents still lagging behind a lot. But Annika, you had another view on this then. So the laws are important and the standards, but you had kind of another perspective on this, why one should work on documents at all.
Yes, of course, the Web Accessibility Directive, as Peter said, it concerns public sector organizations. But actually in Finland, the Finnish legislation is a little bit broader. It concerns also, for example, banks and insurance companies. So for example, all the bank statements and insurance statements that are usually PDFs, they already need to be accessible in Finland. And I have also noticed that some private sector organizations have actually noticed accessibility and even concern it as a competitive advantage, since they want to serve all of their customers on an equal basis. And they have also understood that accessibility will also improve the overall user experience and customer experience to all of their customers. So it's also very important to remember that even though that the legislation would not concern you, there are also other key factors that should be taken into account.
And of course, in Norway, the legislation already since long covers both private and public sector. So, and they are now kind of catching up with the European piece, but also, so we have very different situations in the different Nordic countries, but all of you should make sure that your documents are accessible, no matter what legal scope you're under. So we have a short section on the different situations of documents, where they should be, how they are created, and how you're supposed to deal with them. Could you touch a little bit on that, Peter?
Yeah, that's another aspect I really like to list. So because it's a different thing if you create the document from scratch or you have it handed over to you. It's a different thing to remediate something or have all the possibilities to influence. So there are different situations where you have different control over the document. And there's the on one extreme, we have all met systems that render a PDF file which is completely inaccessible, or we have a lot of documents that were created earlier and they are also not accessible. So in those extreme cases, the only way is to remediate the document that needs to be accessible. It would be ideal if all the documents could be remediated, but I think it's not a possibility. So what we can do is a bit more future-looking in these cases. When a company buys a system that renders PDF documents at the end of the process, it should make sure that they procure a system that provides accessible documents in the end. They should set the requirements in the tender, and very importantly, they should also verify if the product they buy, the system they buy, actually does result in accessible documents. And for that as well, going back, the company or the organization needs people who know how to check it and know what an accessible document means. Now, there's another situation when an organization gets documents provided by an external design supplier. In this case, it's similar. The organization has to declare in advance the requirements. Ideally, would provide the accessible design elements that should be used in those documents. And then again, it has to be verified. It always has to be verified and checked, because it's easy to say something is accessible, but it really has to be. And then on the other end of the spectrum is when you have full control, when you create the document. But even that can have different scenarios or levels. In an organization, there might be a central unit that creates documents like press office. But it's also possible that a lot of people has authoring rights, has a possibility to publish, to create documents that would be published in the end with a lot of changes. But they might be screened. So the important thing there is to provide training, to have experts, to provide training to everybody to a certain level who deals with documents. And then the workflow should be set up in a way that accessibility is taken into consideration from the beginning. It saves a lot of time later.
Yeah, I think, Annika, you had more of a practical example on this one.
Yes, because just recently I was going through 20 annual reports of Finnish organizations. And I noticed that since they are usually PDFs, and most of them were untagged PDFs. So basically meaning that the users of assistive technology might not be able to read them at all. So that's a huge accessibility issue there. And of course, I don't know who has actually created the documents. They are usually created with InDesign. They might be created in-house, or it might be an advertising agency who is actually creating the final report. So you need to understand, is it a training issue in your house, or is it just about how to buy accessible documents and how to verify that they are actually accessible, like Peter said?
Okay, so this is taking slightly longer than according to your plan. So I would like to ask you to shorten your next piece a little bit. But I know that, Annika, you had some ideas about the organizational aspects, and I think that's really important to act on. So if you could do the highlights of that.
Yes, so I'm going to give you some examples, like what actions are actually necessary from an organizational point of view. So 4 points I'd like to present. Define a process for how to actually produce accessible documents. Provide training, instructions, and support for the people in your organization. Make sure that you have the correct tools and good templates for the people to use, and ensure that your visual appearance is accessible. A couple of more points about these 4. So think about a process. Hopefully you have an accessibility specialist that you can think about this with, someone with a lot of experience of accessible documents. Set the target where you want to reach, like make a roadmap. Where do you want to be in 1 year of time or 2 years of time? If you have 1,000 documents online, you will need to think about a roadmap, how to actually fix them. As Peter said, you should have very clear procurement process as well if you are procuring a system that spits out PDFs, or if you're using an advertising agency or something. And also think about how to produce those documents, what types of tools you're going to need, what kinds of skills, how to test them, how to train your people. And of course, very important thing is to make sure that the people in your organizations have the skills that they're going to need. So plan trainings, and remember that people working in different roles might have very different needs when it comes to documents. Some might be only doing Word documents, others are doing PowerPoint presentations, some are working on PDF forms, and so on. So very different types of needs. And write simple instructions, like a memory list. What should I remember when I am writing a Word document, for example? And organize clinics, meaning that, for example, the people in your organization, if they are not able to fix their own documents, they can come to a clinic session with their own document where an accessibility specialist will answer their questions and help them to fix the issues that they're not able to work out by themselves. And remember the IAAP Connections Forum, where you can ask any accessibility related questions. There are a lot of experts who are there to answer any questions you might have. And also consider IAAP certification. So Accessibility Document Specialist, so ADS, that would make sure that you would have real specialists in your organization who can support all the other roles, ask their questions, give them any kind of help or support that they need. What else? Make sure that you have the kind of tools that actually support creating accessible documents. Just one example, Google tools versus Microsoft Office tools. I'm using Google Slides to make the presentations, and I always need to export them to PowerPoint, then make the accessibility fixes, and then save it as a PDF. So that's quite difficult. If I were using PowerPoint to start with, I could do all the accessibility fixes right away. So Microsoft tools have better accessibility options and features. Make sure that you have testing tools. Peter was talking about the verification. So make sure that you have the correct tools to do that. And everyone should be able to use a contrast checker. There are a lot of good contrast checkers available online, or you can install them on your computer. And what is going to help the people in your organization is to actually provide them with accessible document templates. For example, a Word template and a PowerPoint template with accessible styles, readable font, sufficient font size, and colors that are actually accessible. And provide instructions on how to use those templates so that they are not going to break the accessibility of the templates. And a fourth thing, make sure that you have an accessible visual appearance. I know that it's very typical that the brand colors don't have sufficient contrasts. So make the kind of version of the colors that are accessible, that can be used in the documents and in infographics and diagrams as well. And they are quite complicated from many points of view. So provide instructions for the people who are creating infographics and diagrams. So how to make sure that they are accessible to people with poor sight, blind, cognitive disabilities, colorblind, and so on.
Okay, thank you. We do have quite a few questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we can have an interactive session here. So I think we will jump to the questions now, and then Peter, I hope we can kind of conclude with the technical stuff, or maybe we can send it out afterwards. So we have a question here about the legal requirements. I think we touched about that, but what are the potential consequences if I don't make my documents accessible, Peter? What happens? Do I end up in jail?
Not in jail, but so if you're a public sector body, it can depend on the legislation in your country. In some countries, there's no like financial consequences, but some, I think at least 1/3 of the countries installed a system where there are administrative fines for not providing accessible websites and documents. So it can get costly, and it can get even more costly if with under the European Accessibility Act, where actually if you break the rules, if you don't comply, then your product or service can be taken out from the market. And so that's not jail, but that's pretty unpleasant as well.
Yes, true. But within the Web Accessibility Directive for the public sector, the monitoring bodies, most of them try to be the firefighters more than the policemen. So they will start with supporting you and asking you kindly before they give you the penalty. So that is at least what we have, the experience we have. But there is a risk of, or chance or whatever, to get a penalty as well. So thank you, Peter. We have a question from Tanya. What is the minimum font size in digital publications? That is footnotes, image captions. Does ISO 32000 prescribe the minimum font size? Does anyone want to answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Annika?
Yeah. Well, there is no like official rule, but of course it is advisable that no text should be smaller than 9 points, and the main text should be around 12 points.
Yeah, but it also then depends on the lightness of the font, the color used. So it's a bit more complex. I think the basic rule is if you have difficulties seeing it, then it's not good.
Yeah, and if you're...
But yeah, it's good to stick to the minimum threshold numbers. But yeah, as well, 12-point font can be difficult to read if it's a very thin one, for example.
Yeah, and you have to remember that if you're giving a presentation in a big room, you need to make sure that the people sitting at the back can also read the text in your presentation. So on a PowerPoint presentation, it would have to be a lot bigger font.
True. Okay, so the easy question, or the kind of the summary of the answer is there is no legal requirement or really standard pointing to a specific number of points to the type font size, but you need to consider the context and how the document is used. So we have another question about other types of documents than we have touched upon today. What about Google Docs? How would you compare them, compare Word and PDF, for example? And what do you think about Excel sheets? Is there an option to make them accessible at all? Annika, you talked a little bit about PowerPoint versus Google, but is there anything you can say about Word and PDF, for example?
Yeah, of course. The Microsoft tools, they have better solutions when it comes to accessibility. So it's easier to make accessible documents with Microsoft tools.
Mm-hmm. And spreadsheets, I know, Peter, you have tried to make any kind of strange documents accessible. So how do you like Excel?
Yeah, and I really like Excel. Well, so spreadsheets can be made accessible, but in a limited way. So, I mean, a huge spreadsheet is not accessible for anybody. So there are certain rules to make sure that the user knows how to read them. Try to aim for a simple structure and then break up in different tables. Create the proper visual layout as well, so it's easy to digest and understand. They can be made accessible as well. Yeah,
and make sure to train those people who are creating Excel or spreadsheets, because it's a totally different world from, for example, when it comes to Word or PowerPoint.
So we have another interesting question here. Is there a better format to make accessible document than PDF?
I think it goes back to what I said before. It depends what you aim for. If you want an ebook, it's not PDF. If you have a flyer where text is arranged in an interesting way that is easy to digest visually, but it would be difficult to get it in order, then PDF has a lot of flexibility on that. PDF also has the flexibility to change, for example, a diagram into a list, perceived as a list, and to understand it. So it depends on what you do, actually.
Yeah, and it's also very good to think about it. Is the document actually the right way to present the information, or is an HTML page actually more usable and more accessible to the users? For example, if you are writing instructions of some system, why present it as a PDF? Why not just use an HTML page? It is more flexible in so many ways.
Yeah, I think that should be the first question to ask always when you're starting to create a document that you want to publish online. Why am I doing a document? There may be reasons, but many of the documents should be better as HTML, I think, still. So very good point. We have another question kind of connected to that. What about dynamically generated PDFs from HTML code? Like, for example, account statements. Are there any best practice processes for that?
I think if they are generated for HTML, then it would be easier to make them accessible. I think the real problem there, when they are generated from a database, and then accessibility is not considered. And lately there are some services as well, service providers who take this problem on by creating a translator file solution where you can feed in an inaccessible but standard format bank statement, and it gives you an accessible version. And it can be very quick.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have a question about IAAP Nordic, the chapter. Has the chapter engaged with print-disabled readers and organizations of print-disabled to understand the disadvantages and harm that badly built documents are creating? For example, the inability of a person to access medical care because of inaccessible documents. So the chapter as such has been involved in several research projects, not something specifically on this topic, but if I put my Funka hat on, we have done several projects in this arena and also specifically connected to health. So we have some data on that, but it's an ongoing discussion. And I think just the digitalization of society as a topic and kind of the democratization of information and all of that is still something we all need to revisit and make more research on. But the answer is no. So far, IAAP Nordic, the chapter as such, has not specifically researched this, this topic. But I would be happy to hear more about your thoughts. Maybe there's something we can do together. We're always interested in creating projects and see what we can do together with our members or other partners to do some extra research. So we have a question here, or more of a statement maybe. One of my students said that Google spreadsheets are accessible but not usable. Can you explain the difference? He uses JAWS, rather reads HTML export than the spreadsheet itself. So accessible but not usable. That could mean many things, but maybe we can touch upon what that could mean.
It might be about the person not being familiar with spreadsheets as such, like not being experienced user. And of course, it might be also some like usability issues with the whole tool, that it's not usable to many other people as well.
And I think that is like what I said about PowerPoint, that it is possible to kind of, in theory, make them technically accessible. But for many assistive technology users, it's still a very clumsy and difficult format, which means that it's not really usable, even if it's so. I mean, you could comply with everything in WCAG and still not be a very useful or usable website. It doesn't, the minimum requirements of web accessibility, also in the EN standard, to be honest, is just making sure that everything is equally bad. So if we have a really bad service, digital service, it should be equally bad for everyone. It shouldn't discriminate anyone. So everyone, also people with disabilities, should have an equally bad experience. That is what accessibility standards are really about. It sounds like a joke, but it's important to understand. It's not the goal, it's the minimum requirements that we are talking about here. And of course, it's absolutely possible. And often we see that also with some solutions where somebody who doesn't really know accessibility or doesn't test with users, because I think that's usually the case. People read the standard or they have heard something about the technical stuff, but they don't test it with users, real living people. And that's why they then provide a solution that is really shitty. It may be really theoretically accessible. So it is kind of possible to do this with a screen reader, but no screen reader user alive would ever figure out how to do it because it's so kind of counter-intuitive and so on. So there are many examples of this. We could do another webinar about usability and accessibility. It's a good question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and when you are selecting these tools that you are using, remember to consider both accessibility and usability point of view, because there are great differences in the different tools. So remember to test them before actually procuring some tool.
True. So another question here is, what are the common mistakes to avoid when creating accessible documents? Do we have any examples?
Peter had some good examples.
Some good, bad examples.
Presentation, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the most important thing is to think of the structure from the beginning. I think that's the biggest mistake one can make. Just start to write a document and then try to make it accessible, which is already a good thing. But you really should think through the structure of the document, the headings you want to use, how many levels of heading. It should be consistent all through the document, for example. And then also use lists when you can. It makes it much easier to digest the content. And then don't use tables for formatting. And when you use tables, make them simple and understandable. So I think those are like the things that early on should be decided, because you can then add the alternative text to an image at the end as well. But if you don't pay attention to those things from the beginning, then it is very difficult to fix afterwards. And then there's also a comment that PDFs are usually created from a source application, so it's usually transformed from Word file or a PDF or a PowerPoint or InDesign. So also, the earlier you care about accessibility, if you have a very well accessible Word document, then it will allow you to create an accessible PDF format much more easily.
True. So work with templates and don't move away from that. Don't be creative in that part. So, and I would also like to add that. So thank you, Peter. I think that is really true. Starting early with accessibility instead of kind of doing it as an afterthought. But I would also say that people who know a little bit about accessibility and create documents, they usually miss out on the non-technical parts. So they usually miss out on the contrast and the design and the readability and the object placement and all, all the size of the clickable areas and everything like that, because it has so much focus on the assistive technology piece and the tech piece, so that they kind of forget to look at how it actually looks. Is it readable? So that is kind of it's a balance between those two things. So we do have a question about if the slides will be available for the participants. I didn't check this with Annika, but I hope that we can share it. It will be recorded, so I guess it's not secret. So thank you for that. We will send out the slides to everyone that has been online, and we do get more and more questions. This is really interesting. So we have one question which I can't respond to. What is the current state of accessibility for digital documents, and what percentage of documents are estimated to be inaccessible? I am not aware of anyone who has really scanned that. When we did the review of the monitoring of the Web Accessibility Directive, we tried to make that kind of estimations, but unfortunately, very few member states had documents listed in a specific way. So it's really, really hard to say. Just from my gut feeling, which is not very scientific, I would say many. I don't know, Annika, what's your view from your Finnish perspective?
Yeah, actually, the pie chart that I was using in the example, it was from a real study that we did for Finnish screen reader users. So it was only from the screen reader point of view. And we asked, what is the current level of PDF accessibility on Finnish websites at the moment? And I can just show you the image please more
don't,
time.
Because we don't have time.
Yeah, but basically it was all right, the results. So
it was all right. Okay.
Yeah, or very high or high, they were like 37% were like on the good side. So about every third PDF document. But remember that this
which is not very good. But
no, yeah,
okay.
Yeah, but then the bad answers, very low and low, there were 23%. Yeah. Okay. But still, there is a lot of work to do. And like I said, of the Finnish companies' annual reports, most of them were untagged PDFs. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I doubt that as many as a third of the documents would be accessible. Sounds very unlikely to me, but I'm happy if that is the case in Finland. Good on you. Keep up the good work.
And remember, it was only from the screen reader point. Yeah.
But still, if people have done it accessible for screen readers, then at least that is a step somewhere. So it make sure that the person behind the document is somehow aware of something around accessibility. So that is really good. So thank you very much for that. We still have a couple of questions, but I think we will have to round off with a little bit of information about what is happening after this. So I hope I'm now sharing my screen. So after this webinar, we do have some upcoming events that I would like to let you know about. So later this week on the 2nd of March, which is Thursday at 3 p.m. Central European time, we have an IAAP EU webinar, also free of charge for members and non-members, where we also have live captions, international sign, and automatic translations of the captions into German, French, Spanish, and Swedish. As we always have in the IAAP EU webinars. And this one is really, really exciting. So I would recommend it to you. It's Pilar Orero from the University of Barcelona. And she's talking about presenting on a couple of their super interesting research projects on immersive media. So don't miss out on that one. And then for everyone in Finland, we have a meetup with IAAP Nordic. So a face-to-face meetup in Tampere, the beautiful city of Tampere, with the university in Tampere on the 14th of March. And I didn't have the time. I think it's more or less a full day event. So we will present about European legislation, about IAAP, and there are also other speakers around. So Alberto, my colleague, will be on site in Tampere. I will just jump in and talk about the EU legislation online, but that will be a really cool place to be. So please do drop by and meet us in Finland. Also, we have planned webinars in the IAAP Nordic webinar series. We don't have the dates for everything yet, unfortunately, but stay tuned. All of these are in English and free of charge. So in April, we are doing an easy-to-read webinar, collecting easy-to-read experts from the Nordic countries to discuss on how to do it and why it doesn't really work in reality and why it's important and so on. So really interesting panel discussion on easy-to-read coming up in April. In September, we will have a more technical webinar on mobile apps development. We had last year on how to test accessibility in apps, and now we do dig a little bit deeper into the different tools and how to make it work from a development perspective, and the different kinds of mobile apps that are still out there and which way of doing it is better for accessibility and so on. On the 25th of October, we have a webinar that is already fixed, the date. So that has been postponed since last year. It's Anna Stålberg from the Swedish bank Handelsbanken, who is presenting on how to integrate or implement accessibility in a large organization. So very interesting webinar that I also highly recommend. And in November, we will have another one of those Nordic perspective discussions where we have organizations working in multimedia in all the Nordic countries, talking about the legal requirements and how they go about to make sure that multimedia is becoming more accessible for people with disabilities. So that will also be a very interesting discussion, I think. And if you have anything you think we should cover, or if you have a presentation you would like to provide, please let us know. And we do have a very easy email address, info@iaapnordic.org, where you reach Alberto. And if you have any questions about becoming a member, about certification, and about the webinars, or if you would like to volunteer or support us or work with us, then please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, we have reached exactly the hour. So this will be the end of this. Thank you very much for all the questions. We couldn't get through all of them, and we didn't get through all the presentations we wanted to do. So much to say about documents. Maybe we will have a follow-up if people would like that. Thank you very much, Annika, for sharing your knowledge about the Finnish perspective on document accessibility. And thank you, Peter, for the perspective of the Hungarian in a Nordic dressing. Thank you very much, all of you. Thanks for the participants. And I look forward to having this webinar translated into Czech as well. That will be awesome, as always. So have a good rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye.